The human crashed onto the frozen wasteland, their ship torn apart by enemy fire. The blaring alarms had ceased, and the cockpit had filled with smoke and sparks. He fought to stay conscious as the ship spiraled downward. The controls useless, the ground rushing up. To meet him, the impact was jarring. Everything went black, his body battered, his mind groggy. When he opened his eyes, the world was a blur of white and grey. The snow was thick around him, the temperature freezing. He could barely move, the chill biting into his bones. He groaned and forced himself to sit up, his vision swimming. He stared out of the broken cockpit window. Nothing but an endless expanse of snow stretching as far as the eye could see. A cold emptiness filled him. The ship was gone, reduced to scrap. He was stranded on an alien world with no way to call for help, and no chance of survival unless he did something quick. His breath came in visible puffs, the air so thin it burned in his lungs. His hands trembled as he reached for the emergency survival pack stashed beneath the seat. With shaking fingers, he tore it open and pulled out the basic supplies: water rations, a small thermal blanket, a flare gun. These were the tools that could keep him alive for another day, maybe two, but the cold was relentless, and the supplies were limited. He needed shelter, and fast stumbling out of the wreckage, he fought against the weight of his body, his legs barely able to hold him up. The snow was deep, and the wind howled around him. He had no idea where he was or how far he'd drifted, but he couldn't afford to waste time. The storm was closing in. The cold would take him if he didn't find shelter soon. His breath hitched as the first wave of frostbite began to set in the tips of his fingers. Aching, he staggered forward. The only thing keeping him going was the urge to survive. He had no choice but to push on. For hours he trudged through the snow, his mind spinning with the weight of his situation. He was alone on a planet he knew nothing about, surrounded by hostile forces, with no way of calling for help. The thought of it was suffocating, but he didn't have time to think. He needed to find shelter, or he would die in the freezing cold. At last, he saw something in the distance, a faint silhouette against the white expanse. It looked like a structure, an outpost, or some kind of building. His heart skipped a beat, and he stumbled towards it with renewed hope. It was a small outpost made of metal and ice, half buried in the snow. The door was slightly ajar, and when he pushed it open, it creaked loudly, like it hadn't been used in years. Inside, the walls were covered in frost and dust, but there was warmth, a faint heat in the air, a welcome reprieve from the biting cold. He collapsed inside, exhausted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The warmth hit him like a drug. His eyes fluttered as he scanned the room, and that's when he saw it, the figure standing in the shadows, a tall, hulking presence, half hidden in the dim light, its eyes glowing faintly as it turned to face him. He froze, his body tensing, his mind racing. It wasn't human. It was an alien, a warrior of some sort. It was hard to tell beneath the layers of armor and the cold glare of its eyes. But the message was clear. He had just stumbled into the territory of someone or something far more dangerous than the icy planet outside. The alien stepped forward, its voice deep and commanding, a language he couldn't understand. But the tone was unmistakable. Its words were slow and deliberate. It didn't need to speak. The human could sense the threat radiating from it. The warrior took a step closer, eyes never leaving him, its gaze sharp like a predator, locking onto prey. The human swallowed his fear and slowly reached for the flare gun, his only weapon. The alien stopped and tilted its head, as if studying him, its posture rigid, its movements fluid and precise. It didn't seem like a creature that needed to speak to convey power. The human had no choice but to act with his back against the wall and the enemy before him. The only option was survival. It was either fight or freeze, and he knew which one would be worse. The human gripped the flare gun tightly, his fingers numb from the cold, but the weapon felt heavy in his hand, a weak defense against the towering alien in front of him. The alien didn't seem to care about the flare gun. It took another step closer, its presence overwhelming. The human's mind raced. He couldn't fight his creature. It was too strong, too fast, and he had no idea what it was capable of. But the cold outside was even worse, and he knew if he tried to run, he would never make it back to the wreckage alive. The alien's eyes seemed to narrow, and it made a sound like a low growl. The human tensed every muscle in his body, ready to react if it lunged at him. The alien stopped, and its head tilted to the side, as if it was considering something. It spoke again in a language the human couldn't understand, But this time the tone was different, almost inquisitive. The human didn't lower the flare gun, but he didn't raise it either. The alien wasn't attacking, and he wasn't about to make the first move. He just needed time to think. Then, to his surprise, the alien stepped back and pointed toward the back of the shelter. Its gesture was clear. It was offering him something, but what was it? The human hesitated, his mind working overtime. He didn't have many choices, and even fewer options in this frozen wasteland. The alien's eyes never left him, and after a long, tense moment, the human made his decision. Slowly, he lowered the flare gun, his instincts telling him that an immediate fight would only end one way, and he needed to survive at least a little longer. His legs were stiff and aching. As he moved towards where the alien had pointed, he was still on edge, ready to react at any moment. But the alien didn't stop him. Instead, it seemed to watch him closely, almost like a predator assessing its prey. The human glanced over his shoulder, but the alien remained silent, its glowing eyes fixed on him as he moved toward the back of the shelter. It was a small room, barely big enough to stand in, but it had a small cot and a few survival supplies scattered across the floor, enough to survive for a few days at least. The human moved to sit on the cot, his body desperate for rest. But he didn't trust the alien, not yet. He kept his flare gun within reach and watched as the alien moved to the center of the room, its posture relaxed, but still full of that predatory grace. The human couldn't help but wonder how long the alien had been here and why it hadn't left. But there was no time to waste. He needed to think of a plan. The cold was seeping into his bones, and he knew it wouldn't be long before he would be too weak to do anything about it. His eyes flicked back to the alien, who was now crouching on the floor, as if waiting for something. The human's mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening, why the alien had spared him, why it hadn't killed him on sight. After all, it was obvious the creature was a warrior, and he was nothing but a stranded survivor. But then the alien did something unexpected. It reached up and removed its helmet, revealing the face beneath. The human froze, his breath catching in his throat. The alien's face was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its skin was a pale blue-gray, and its eyes were a glowing yellow that seemed to pierce right through him. But it was the expression that caught him off guard. There was no malice in it, no anger, just a strange mixture of curiosity and maybe even a hint of something else. The human wasn't sure what to make of it. His heart was pounding in his chest. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He kept his eyes locked on the alien's face. The warrior studied him for a moment before speaking again. This time, the words were different. They didn't sound like threats or commands, but something else, something that could be a request or perhaps an order. The human's mind raced, trying to decipher the alien's intent, but he couldn't make sense of it. The silence between them stretched long and thick. He was on the edge of his seat, wondering what the alien would do next. Then the alien spoke again, but this time the words were clear in tone. The human didn't understand the language, but the message was unmistakable. The alien was offering him something, not just shelter, but something more. It wasn't a choice he had expected, and it left him more confused than before. But there was one thing he did know: he was alive for now, and the cold was just outside the door. But it seemed that he wasn't the only one struggling with survival on this frozen planet. The human didn't move at first, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The alien had spoken, and yet the words meant nothing to him. The tone was different, though softer somehow, like it was trying to communicate something other than violence. The warrior's eyes glowed with a strange intensity, but there was no immediate threat. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The human's breath was shallow and ragged from the cold, a flare gun still in his hand. The alien's gaze never wavered from him, its posture still tense, but no longer aggressive. The human could feel the tension in the air, like a tight rope ready to snap if either of them made a wrong move. But the alien didn't lunge at him. Instead, it waited, watching him closely, as if trying to gauge his next action. The human didn't know what to do. He couldn't trust the alien, not yet. But the reality of his situation pressed in on him harder than any weapon could. The cold was unforgiving. The shelter was only temporary, and the alien wasn't going anywhere if he wanted to survive. This was the reality he had to face, at least for now. The human let out a slow breath and looked around the room, searching for something useful. His gaze settled on the small cot, a few blankets, and the remnants of a fire that had long since gone out. The outpost was sparse, and there was little to work with, but it was a roof over his head for the moment, And it would have to do. He slowly eased himself onto the cot, his muscles aching from exhaustion, the flare gun still clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't take his eyes off the alien. As he settled in the warmth of the shelter was a welcome relief, but it did little to ease the gnawing fear in his chest. The alien hadn't attacked yet, but that didn't mean it wouldn't. The warrior's eyes flicked briefly to the cot and then back to the human, as if considering something. The human felt a chill run through him again. But it wasn't from the cold, it was something else, a sense of unease that only grew stronger with every passing second. The alien was still watching him, its expression unreadable, and for a moment, the human wondered what the creature wanted. Was it trying to communicate? Was it waiting for something? And if so, what? But then the alien stood and moved to the far corner of the room, its movements graceful and deliberate. It didn't speak, just went about its business, seemingly indifferent to the human's presence, at least for the moment. The human took the opportunity to gather his thoughts, to think beyond the immediate fear that gripped him. His ship was gone, and even if he managed to escape this shelter, he was still stranded on a hostile world with no way of calling for help. But perhaps he could use the alien's presence to his advantage. After all, it was a warrior. Surely it had knowledge of survival and combat that he didn't possess. Maybe they could help each other. The human's mind worked quickly, formulating a plan, if only to make the best of the situation. He couldn't afford to wait and see what the alien would do. He needed to take control of his own fate, somehow. But before he could think any further, the alien spoke again, its voice deep and resonant. The human tensed his muscles tight, with readiness, expecting a threat. But instead, the words were calm. Even though he didn't understand them, the alien was offering something. It wasn't an attack or a command. It was an invitation, a strange kind of request. The human didn't know what to make of it. The warrior had already shown it could kill him without hesitation. But now it seemed like it was trying to communicate something different. The human opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. He had no idea how to respond to this strange being in front of him. What did it want? What did it need? And what did he need to do to survive? He had no answers, but the uncertainty gnawed at him, and time was running out. He needed warmth, food, and shelter, and the alien had those things. He needed the alien too. But he couldn't show weakness, not now. The human stared at the alien, trying to read its intent. The warrior's eyes glowed steadily in the dim light of the shelter, and for a moment, the human saw something there, something almost human, a flicker of understanding. Or maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but it made him hesitate. The tension between them hung heavy in the air. And the human knew one thing for sure: if he wanted to make it off this frozen world alive, he would have to find a way to navigate this strange new alliance with the alien, even if it meant sharing warmth or something more that he wasn't yet ready to face. The human sat still, watching the alien, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't process fast enough. The alien's presence in the shelter was like a constant pressure. Its eyes never left him, not once, and it felt like the very air between them crackled with something. He couldn't define it. Was as if the alien was studying him, waiting for him to make the next move. But what could he do? He had no real choice but to play along. He didn't understand the alien's language or its customs, but he knew that survival was the only goal now, and that meant accepting whatever help the alien was offering, even if it came at a price. He had no idea what the price would be, but there was no escaping the reality of his situation. The cold was still there, gnawing at the edges of his senses, and his body was already starting to slow from exhaustion. The heat in the shelter was a relief, but it was not enough to erase the chill that had sunk deep into his bones. His muscles felt heavy, and his vision blurred. But he couldn't allow himself to succumb to the cold. Not yet, not while the alien was still there watching him. So he fought to keep his focus. The warrior didn't speak again. Its eyes remained fixed on him, its posture relaxed, but still vigilant, as though waiting for something more from him. The human swallowed hard, his mouth dry, and his throat tight. He didn't know how long he could keep this up, how long he could pretend he wasn't afraid. But he had to hold it together. For just a little while longer, the alien was still there. After all, it hadn't attacked or killed him, and that in itself was strange. But it didn't make the situation any less dangerous. The human shifted uneasily on the cot, his eyes flicking back to the flare gun still within reach. but it felt like a useless tool against a being like the alien. What good would it do to fire a flare if the alien could crush him with one hand? What was he supposed to do? The questions circled around him like vultures. But there was no time to answer them. His body was still shaking from the cold, and the fear gnawing at him, making his thoughts scatter like wind-blown dust. And then the alien did something unexpected. It moved closer to him, its footsteps light and quiet. But the air seemed to thrum with the weight of its approach. The human's heart raced in his chest, and his breath caught in his throat. But he didn't move. He couldn't move. He could only watch as the alien stopped just short of the cot and knelt down, its face now mere inches from his. The human instinctively tensed. But the warrior didn't lash out. It simply stared at him, its glowing yellow eyes intense, but not hostile. There was something almost curious about the way it looked at him, and that made the human hesitate. Was it possible that the alien wasn't here to kill him after all? Was it possible that it wanted something else, something the human couldn't understand? The warrior didn't make any sudden movements. It simply studied him, as though trying to read his every thought, and for a moment the human felt exposed, as if the alien could see right through him. But then the tension broke. The alien's face shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something in its expression, a subtle change that the human couldn't quite place. And then it spoke, its voice low and rough, but the words were clear now, not in the language of its species, but something else, something the human could understand just enough for the meaning to hit home: share warmth or freeze. The words echoed in the silence, and the human's breath caught in his chest. It was a simple offer, but it carried with it a weight that was anything but simple. It was an ultimatum, an unspoken understanding that this was the only option left for both of them. They could fight, but there was no hope of winning, not against the cold, not against the planet. They were stranded on No. They could only survive together or die alone. The alien's gaze never wavered as it waited for the human's response. There was no anger in its eyes, no malice, just an unwavering sense of purpose. As if this was the only path forward, the human swallowed his fear and took a deep breath. He didn't trust the alien, not yet, but he couldn't deny the fact that they needed each other, and the cold was an enemy neither of them could defeat alone. With that thought, the human slowly lowered the flare gun and nodded barely perceptibly. The alien studied him for a moment longer before it rose and moved to the other side of the shelter, still keeping a close eye on the human. But this time the air felt different, less tense, as if some unspoken agreement had been made. The human exhaled and settled back into the cot, his mind still spinning, but his body's need for rest more urgent than anything else. The warmth of the shelter seemed to settle around him, and for the first time since he'd crash-landed on this alien world, he allowed himself to relax just slightly. But it was a fragile peace, a moment of calm in the storm of uncertainty that lay ahead. The cold was still out there, and the alien was still a mystery. But for now they had found something to share, and maybe that was enough to survive another night. The night passed in uneasy silence. The warmth in the shelter was a fleeting comfort, the cold outside still pressing against the walls like a constant reminder of how fragile their survival was. The human lay still on the cot, his body exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind raced with questions about the alien, its motives, its behavior, and what had brought them to this unlikely alliance. The alien had shown no interest in attacking after the human had agreed to share warmth, but that didn't mean it wasn't still dangerous. It was a warrior, after all, and warriors had their own codes, their own rules, and the human had no idea what those rules were. The alien was still watching him, though its presence in the corner of the shelter, a quiet but constant force. Its glowing yellow eyes never strayed from the human. For long its posture was relaxed, but there was an intensity to its gaze that suggested it was always alert, always watching. The human could feel the alien's gaze like a weight pressing down on him, but he refused to look over at it. He couldn't afford to show weakness. Not yet. The storm outside was picking up. The wind howled louder than ever, and the temperature was dropping further. The human could feel the chill creeping in again. His fingers and toes were beginning to stiffen, and he knew that if he stayed still for too long, the cold would take over his body. He needed to do something, anything, to keep moving, to keep the blood flowing. But he couldn't risk drawing attention to himself. The alien had been calm since the first confrontation, But that didn't mean it trusted him. The human couldn't risk making any wrong moves. One misstep could cost him everything. But then the alien stood and moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The human tensed, but didn't move. The alien was near now, its presence overwhelming. But it wasn't attacking it, wasn't threatening it, was simply there watching him with those glowing eyes. The human sat up slowly, his muscles stiff and sore. But he couldn't stay in one position for long. The alien knelt down beside him, its eyes never leaving him. The human didn't know what to make of it. Was it waiting for him to speak? Was it waiting for him to make a move? The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The human fought to steady his breath, the flare gun still within reach. But he knew it wouldn't do him any good if the alien decided to turn on him. The alien spoke again, this time its voice was softer, quieter. But the human still didn't understand the language. He couldn't tell if the words were a question or a statement, but the tone was different. It wasn't demanding like before, it was almost curious. The alien waited as though expecting some kind of response, but the human didn't know what to say. He was exhausted, cold, and scared. And he didn't have any answers to give. The warrior's expression didn't change, its glowing eyes still fixed on him. But there was a subtle shift in its posture. It seemed less tense, somehow more relaxed, as if it was waiting for something to happen. But the human couldn't figure out what it wanted. The alien wasn't making any aggressive moves, but it was still dangerous, it was still unpredictable, and the human knew better than to trust it fully. He had to survive. And to do that he had to be cautious and ready for anything. Then, without warning, the alien stood up and moved toward the door of the shelter. The human watched it carefully, his heart beating faster as the alien reached for the door handle. It paused and looked back at him for a moment. The human's breath caught in his throat, wondering if it was going to leave or if it was going to do something else. But then the alien pushed the door open and stepped outside into the blizzard. The wind howled fiercely as the door slammed shut behind it. The human blinked, unsure of what to make of the alien's sudden departure. He hadn't expected it to leave, not like this, alone in the shelter. The human's eyes darted around the room for a moment before he forced himself to relax just slightly. It wasn't safe to panic, not yet. He had to stay calm and keep his wits about him. The storm outside was merciless. The cold had already crept into the shelter, and the human knew it wouldn't be long before it got worse. He needed to figure out what to do next. The alien was gone, and he was left in the silence of the shelter. Once more, he stood up slowly, his legs stiff. But he had to keep moving. He had to make sure he was still capable of surviving the elements. No matter how cold it got, he wasn't going to freeze to death here. Not without a fight. The shelter was sparse, with few resources left to scavenge. But there was enough to keep him going for a little longer, at least he hoped. So the storm raged outside, the howling winds, making it impossible to see anything beyond the shelter walls. The human moved to the window and looked out into the blizzard. But there was nothing to see, just a swirling mass of snow and ice. The alien had disappeared into the storm, but the human couldn't afford to worry about it now. His main concern was survival, and that meant finding a way to make it through another day. The shelter was a small mercy, but it wasn't enough to keep him safe for long. He had to think of something better, a plan, a way out of this frozen hellscape. But for now, there was nothing he could do except wait and hope the alien would return soon, and maybe, with it, some answers about what he had gotten himself into. The human paced the shelter, his thoughts racing. His mind was a whirlwind of questions and fears. The alien had left him alone, and the storm outside raged with an intensity that seemed to match his anxiety. Every minute that passed without the alien's return only made the silence feel more oppressive. The cold had settled in deeper now, his breath visible in the air with each exhale, and his body trembled with the constant chill. The warmth of the shelter was a fading memory. As the temperature continued to drop, he moved back to the cot reluctantly. But he knew there was nothing to do except wait. The human couldn't shake the feeling of unease that hung over him like a shadow. The alien's disappearance only made things worse. What did it want? Why had it left? And would it return? He couldn't afford to relax, not now, not when survival was so uncertain. The storm outside was unrelenting, and he knew that if the alien didn't return soon, he would be forced to venture out into the blizzard on his own. The thought made his stomach twist with dread, but he knew it was a real possibility. The wreckage of his ship was somewhere out there, buried beneath the snow, But with the storm in full force, it was almost impossible to navigate the frozen wasteland. He couldn't stay in the shelter forever. He would run out of supplies before long, and the cold would eventually get the better of him. His eyes flicked toward the door, hoping for some sign that the alien might return. But the door remained closed. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and the human pulled his coat tighter around himself, trying to conserve as much body heat as he could. The shelter was small and cramped, but it wasn't enough to keep the cold at bay. For long he had to think of something, but his mind was sluggish with exhaustion, the fear gnawing at him like a constant presence. The human's thoughts kept circling back to the alien. What had it meant? But offering warmth, what had it expected in return? He had no answers, and the uncertainty made him restless. He needed to keep moving, or he would succumb to the cold. He couldn't let himself freeze in this desolate place. But where could he go? What could he do? His ship was gone, and he had no way of contacting anyone. The only thing he had was the alien, and he didn't know if that was a blessing or a curse. Just when the human thought he couldn't stand it anymore, the door to the shelter creaked open, and the alien stepped back inside. The human froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The warrior was back, but it didn't move immediately. It stood in the doorway for a moment, as though considering something, its glowing yellow eyes scanning the room before settling on the human. The human's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he didn't know what to do. His body tensed as he waited for the alien to make a move, but it simply stepped into the shelter and closed the door behind it. The temperature in the room seemed to drop even further as the alien removed its helmet and looked at him. The human's eyes widened slightly. The warrior was covered in snow, its armor caked with the frozen remnants of the storm, its breath visible in the cold air. But it didn't seem bothered by the cold. It had endured the blizzard without hesitation, and now it was here in the shelter once again. The human was unsure what to make of the alien's return, but he couldn't afford to be ungrateful. It had braved the storm to come back to him, and that had to mean something. But what the warrior's gaze remained fixed on him as it stepped closer. This time it didn't speak, it didn't demand anything, it simply stood there waiting. The human shifted uneasily, but didn't back away, his mind still racing with questions. What did the alien want? What had it learned in the storm? But before he could ask anything, the alien moved again. It didn't hesitate this time. It knelt down beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. The human froze. The touch was cold, but not in a painful way. It was the touch of a being that had known the cold for much longer than he had. The alien's touch wasn't hostile, but it was firm and steady. The human's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the action. Was the alien trying to offer reassurance, or was this just a prelude to something else? The human couldn't tell, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down completely. Either he kept his focus on the warrior as the alien continued to watch him silently. The silence stretched on, but this time it wasn't as heavy, it wasn't as tense. The human could feel the weight of the alien's presence, but it didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt like the two of them were caught in the same struggle for survival. The cold was still out there, and neither of them could defeat it alone. The alien's hand lingered for a moment longer before it pulled back, and the human let out a breath. He hadn't realized he was holding the warrior didn't move away. Instead, it continued to watch him, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the shelter. The human knew that the alien was waiting for something from him, but he didn't know what it was. He didn't have answers to give, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. Now the storm outside was still raging, but the shelter felt a little warmer now that the alien had returned. Maybe they could find a way to survive this together. Maybe the alien was more than just a cold-hearted warrior. Maybe it was something else too. But the human didn't know yet. He didn't know what the alien wanted or why it had returned. All he knew was that they were both stuck in this frozen world together, and he had to figure out how to make the best of it before the cold took them both. The shelter felt smaller with each passing minute. The alien's presence was constant, but not suffocating. It hovered near him like a quiet force, a silent watcher waiting for something. The human couldn't define. The warrior had returned, but it hadn't spoken since its last action. It had placed its hand on his shoulder and then pulled back, leaving the human with nothing but the weight of its gaze to contend with. The human's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The alien had been out in the storm for what felt like hours, yet it had returned without showing any sign of distress. The cold didn't seem to affect it the way it did him. The human couldn't help but feel a strange mix of admiration and fear. The warrior was otherworldly in its strength, its ability to endure what would have killed most beings. But that didn't mean it was friendly or even trustworthy. The silence between them grew longer, and the human found himself struggling to break it. What did the alien want? What was it waiting for? Why had it returned to the shelter without any warning? The warrior's eyes flicked to the window for a moment, its gaze distant, as if it were calculating something, but then it turned back to the human, its expression unreadable. The human shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. He couldn't find the words, even though they swirled in his mind. He had no idea how to communicate with the alien, how to ask the questions that were burning in his mind, so he simply sat in the quiet and waited. The minutes felt like hours, the weight of the silence pressing down on him, until finally the alien moved. It was subtle at first, just a shift in its posture, but then it stood and moved toward the far corner of the shelter. The human watched it carefully, still unsure of what to expect. The warrior didn't seem to be in a hurry. It moved with a grace that belied its size, but every movement was deliberate and calculated. The human's eyes followed the alien as it approached a small table in the corner of the shelter. The table was cluttered with scattered equipment and scraps of supplies that the human had scavenged from the wreckage of his ship. He watched as the alien picked up a small metal object and examined it with interest. The human's mind raced, trying to figure out what the alien was doing, but he had no idea. The warrior's actions were deliberate, but not threatening, and the human found himself utterly fascinated at the sight of it, examining the items in the shelter as though it was searching for something. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't as uncomfortable. The human had the strange sense that the alien wasn't just observing him, it was trying to understand him, trying to figure out what he needed or what he could offer. But the human didn't know what the alien wanted from him. What could he give that would make any difference in the situation? Was survival enough? Or did the alien want something more? But before he could dwell on the question for too long, the alien looked back at him, its glowing eyes meeting his with an intensity that made the human's breath catch in his throat. The warrior didn't speak, but its gaze seemed to hold a question, a challenge perhaps. But the human couldn't read it. He couldn't figure out what the alien was trying to say, and that uncertainty gnawed at him like a constant reminder of how little he understood this being standing before him. The alien had shown kindness in its own way by returning to the shelter, but that didn't mean it had let down its guard. The human knew better than to assume anything. The warrior had a purpose, and that purpose might not align with his own. He had to be careful every step of the way. He couldn't afford to trust the alien completely, not yet, not until he understood more. The human looked away from the alien for a moment, his eyes scanning the shelter, trying to distract himself from the pressure of the situation. But when he looked back, the warrior was standing even closer now, its presence more imposing than before. The human stiffened instinctively, but the alien didn't make any threatening moves. It simply stood there watching him. The human swallowed his fear and stood up slowly, his legs aching from the hours of inactivity. But he couldn't let that stop him. He had to move. He had to keep himself from freezing in place like a trapped animal. He didn't know what the alien was waiting for, but he knew he had to respond. Somehow the warrior's eyes followed him as he moved, but there was no sign of aggression in the alien's gaze, just a steady watchfulness. The human's heart pounded in his chest as he reached the far wall of the shelter and then stopped, unsure of what to do next. But the alien moved again. This time it stepped forward with purpose, its hand extended toward him. The human froze for a moment, his mind racing. But he didn't retreat. He couldn't afford to act out of fear. Not now, not when the alien had shown no indication of attacking. The warrior's hand was close now, hovering just in front of him. The human hesitated, but then slowly reached out his own hand toward the alien's. He didn't know what would happen if they touched, but it felt like the only thing he could do in this moment. The human's fingers brushed against the alien's hand, and he was surprised by the warmth that radiated from it. Despite the cold that surrounded them, the alien's touch was firm, but not aggressive. It was almost reassuring in its steadiness. The human exhaled slowly as the warrior held his hand there for a moment longer, before slowly pulling away, its eyes never leaving his. The human's heart was still racing, but there was a strange sense of relief in the air between them. He didn't know what the future held or what the alien wanted from him, But for the first time since the crash, he felt like there was a possibility of survival, a chance to make it through this frozen wasteland together. The human stood still, his hand still tingling from the touch of the alien's skin, as the warrior stepped back, its eyes never leaving him. The silence that had once felt so oppressive now felt different, somehow less threatening. It was as though the air between them had shifted, something unspoken had passed between them, a fragile understanding perhaps, or maybe just the beginning of one, but the human couldn't be sure. All he knew was that the alien hadn't harmed him, and hadn't demanded anything from him, yet he didn't know what to make of the quiet between them. There was no clear direction to their relationship, no obvious next step. The alien was still watching him, waiting. But for what the human didn't know, he couldn't afford to relax, not fully. He still had to be cautious. No matter what had just happened, the storm outside raged on the howling winds, battering against the shelter's walls. But the human found that his focus had shifted from the storm to the alien. The warrior's presence filled the room, its form looming large and imposing, but not with hostility, just with its own quiet intensity. The alien wasn't a threat in the traditional sense, but it was still an unknown, and the human knew that an unknown could be the most dangerous of all. He glanced toward the small table in the corner of the shelter where the alien had been before. Its attention now fully on him, the human felt an urge to break the silence, to ask questions, to demand answers. But he couldn't bring himself to speak, not yet. He wasn't ready for the alien to react to his words. He wasn't sure how it would respond, or if it would even understand. But that was the least of his concerns. What he needed was a plan. He needed to know what to do next, how to make it through this never-ending storm, how to survive this situation with the aliens still in the picture. The human walked toward the window and peered out. The snow was falling in heavy sheets. The visibility was near zero, and the storm showed no signs of letting up anytime soon. He had been stranded here for what felt like days, but the wreckage of his ship was still buried under the snow. Somewhere out there, it seemed like a distant memory, now a forgotten hope. But the human couldn't forget that he had to keep going. He couldn't afford to give up, not when there was still a chance to survive. But the alien's presence complicated everything. It was a constant reminder that he wasn't alone. Not that he had wanted to be, but this was a different kind of loneliness, the kind that came with uncertainty. The human turned back toward the alien, who was still watching him from its position across the room, its eyes glinting in the dim light of the shelter. The human's chest tightened as he wondered what the alien was thinking, what it wanted from him. The warrior didn't seem to have a clear agenda. Its actions were confusing. It had helped him survive the storm so far, but it hadn't spoken in a way he could understand. Its intentions were shrouded in mystery, and that was something the human couldn't afford to ignore. In a way, the alien was just as trapped in this storm as he was, maybe even more so, since it had no apparent way of communicating with him. But the human was certain of one thing: the alien was not just some passive presence. It had a purpose, a reason for being here, even if he couldn't fathom it. Yet he had to be ready for whatever it might be. The warrior stood up suddenly, its body tense with an energy that felt almost like anticipation. The human froze, unsure of what the alien would do next. But the warrior didn't move closer. It simply stood tall, its eyes scanning the room once more before it turned its back on the human and walked toward the door. The human's heart skipped a beat. The door was still shut, and the wind still howled outside, but the alien was leaving. Or was it just a change of position? The human wasn't sure, but he didn't have the luxury of waiting to find out. He rushed forward, instinctively, his mind telling him that he couldn't afford to let the alien out of his sight. Not now, not with the storm raging, and the alien's true intentions still unknown. But as he reached the door, the warrior turned its head slightly to look at him again, and for the first time since the alien had arrived, the human thought he saw something in its eyes, something almost human. The warrior wasn't leaving, it was simply observing the storm outside, and the human felt an odd sense of relief. He wasn't sure why, but he was grateful for the alien's continued presence. The warrior had become a part of this strange new reality for him. The alien was the only other living being in this frozen wasteland, and for all the fear it had instilled in him, it was also his only chance at survival. The human stepped back from the door, feeling a strange pull inside himself. He couldn't explain it, but the idea of the alien leaving felt like a mistake, something he couldn't afford to let happen. The warrior was still watching the storm, its posture calm yet alert, as though it were waiting for something, but for what the human didn't know yet. But that feeling in his gut told him that the storm wasn't the only thing they were both waiting for. The alien wasn't here just to survive the storm, it was here for something else, something that he was still trying to understand. The question remained unanswered, but the human could feel it in the air. Between them, there was more to the alien's presence than survival, more to its silence, than just waiting to escape the storm. The human didn't know if it would ever make sense, or if he would ever truly understand the warrior. But one thing was clear, they were in this together now, and whatever came next, they would face it as two survivors against the cold. The storm outside raged with an intensity that seemed to grow by the minute. The wind howled like a living thing, and the snow piled higher against the shelter's walls, but inside the air was thick with tension, and the quiet presence of the alien. The human paced nervously, unable to settle his mind or his body. The strange bond between him and the alien had deepened over the last few hours of days. He couldn't tell how much time had passed since the warrior had returned, and since they had first shared that silent understanding. But now it felt like something was about to happen, something that would change everything. The alien had not spoken since it had touched his shoulder. Its movements were calculated, its eyes always scanning its surroundings, its focus always shifting between the storm outside and the human inside. The warrior was alert, as though waiting for something, but what the human couldn't be sure. He had come to realize that the alien wasn't just a creature to be feared. It wasn't simply a cold-hearted warrior with its own agenda. It was something more, something that even the human didn't fully understand yet. But it was also his only ally in this frozen world, and the idea of losing that connection filled him with a deep sense of dread. The human felt his pulse quicken as the warrior's eyes turned toward him. Once more, the alien was silent, but there was an intensity in its gaze that made the human stop moving for a moment. The warrior was waiting for something, but the human didn't know what. Maybe it was just waiting for the storm to pass. Maybe it was waiting for the right moment to act. Whatever the case, the human could feel the weight of the alien's presence pressing down on him, and it was both comforting and terrifying at the same time. The warrior's steady gaze held his for a long moment before it finally turned away, and once again it looked toward the door. The human's eyes followed the alien's gaze, and for a brief second he wondered if the warrior was considering leaving, if it was going to venture back out into the storm again. The thought made his chest tighten and his throat dry. He couldn't let the alien leave. Not now, not when they had come so far together. Not when survival seemed so uncertain without it. But the warrior didn't move, it didn't step toward the door. Instead, it turned its attention back to the human, its glowing eyes never leaving him. The human's breath caught in his throat as the alien approached slowly, its movements deliberate, but not threatening. Its presence filled the room like a storm in itself. But the human didn't retreat this time, he didn't step back. He stood his ground despite the fear that still lingered inside him. The alien stopped just in front of him, its eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his heart race. The human could feel the heat of its body. Now the warmth that the warrior exuded seemed to fill the space between them. But it wasn't just the physical warmth that made the human feel this strange pull. It was something else, something intangible. The alien's gaze softened ever so slightly, as though it were considering something. And for a brief moment, the human thought he saw something in its eyes, something that resembled compassion, or maybe it was just the human's own desperation projecting his own feelings onto the warrior's unreadable face. But whatever it was, it made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't hope either. It was something in between, a feeling of vulnerability, a realization that they were both stuck in this frozen wasteland together, and somehow they had become each other's only chance at survival. The silence between them grew again. But this time it wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was filled with a quiet understanding, a shared recognition of the reality. They both faced the storm, wasn't letting up, and neither of them could survive alone. The human had realized that in the last few hours or days, he didn't know which, but it didn't matter. What mattered now was that they had to face this together. He couldn't let the alien leave, but he couldn't stop it either. Whatever the warrior was waiting for, it would come in its own time. The human exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air of the shelter, and he nodded once, just a small gesture, but it felt like something significant. He didn't know what the alien would make of it, But in that moment, he wasn't just a human survivor trapped in a shelter. He was a part of something larger, something that involved both him and the warrior. And he felt an odd sense of peace settle over him, not because he knew what would happen next, but because he knew that whatever it was, they would face it together. The alien stepped back just a little, but its eyes stayed locked on his. The human could feel the weight of that gaze, even as the warrior began to turn away. But before it did, it gave a single nod of its own, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough. The human felt something shift in the air between them. It wasn't a promise or a guarantee, but it was an acknowledgement that they had reached some kind of understanding. The warrior had not left, and it hadn't attacked. It had chosen to stay. And that was more than the human had dared to hope, for when he first crashed on this cold and alien world, the human swallowed the lump in his throat and turned to face the storm again. The winds were still howling, but the shelter had become something more than just a place of survival. It had become a shared space, a place where both he and the alien could exist together in this frozen world, where the cold could not break them, not while they still had each other. The human didn't know what the future held. For the first time since the crash, he had hope, not for himself alone, but for them both together. They would endure the storm and whatever came after.